Well, good morning. I'm Dan Mrvos from Ridge Security, and I'm here with Eric Bowerman, who's the CISO at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, DFW, as we all know it. That sounds like a big job.
It kind of is. I think it's interesting. When I first came to the airport, I figured it was just another cyber gig. And when I took that first trip after I got it and saw the blinky lights and all the passengers and all of the buildings that I had to worry about, that's kind of when it kind of hit home, I guess, that it's a little bigger than just, hey, we got to make sure we're HIPAA compliant or something like that. You know, there's actually lives that you could affect.
Well, absolutely. I mean, yeah, the seriousness of it is immense. But, you know, as I thought about this and I thought about talking to you today, I started going through in my mind all of the systems and all of the different technologies that are under one roof. And I think you have a very unique IT environment and probably a very unique threat environment. Maybe you could sketch out for listeners exactly what an airport is responsible for, because they probably think of it as just the place where, you know, they catch a plane.
Yeah. Well, and DFW is a little unique because we're actually our own city. It's actually DFW Airport, Texas. So we have not only the airfield itself, but also fire, police, aviation security. So we have our own Department of Public Safety, basically. We also have real estate folks because we manage a lot of the buildings that we rent out or the land. Exactly.
So when I think of OT at an airport, you know, what immediately comes to mind are, of course, the baggage systems and baggage scanners. Then I think to security cameras. Without divulging anything that, you know, the public shouldn't know, what other sorts of OT is there that the public might not think about?
Sure. So we've got sensors everywhere, and we're trying to expand that even more. So the sensors on the passenger boarding bridges, for instance, we want to be able to measure passengers, how many people are getting on the aircraft, what the vibration is like whenever people are walking on it, or, you know, whenever it's sitting by itself, is it doing it something strange? There's a lot of environmental sensors that we have, weather stations, each of the airfield lights, for instance, you know, that are actually, you know, on the runways and such. Those are all controlled by IT or OT. And then we also have our own water and utilities plant. So we've got, you know, to deal with making sure that the cooling systems work. All of the HVAC is centralized for all of the terminals and things like that. So there's a lot that goes into it.
Right. So all of that building management, building infrastructure, and well,
exactly.
And it's a city, as we now know. That's really interesting. So given that backdrop, what keeps your senior management up at night, and what keeps you up at night, whether it's a particular threat or a particular occurrence that you would like to avoid?
Yeah, I think, you know, everybody's trying to prepare or a little nervous about ransomware just because that's very impactful. Even though ransomware itself seems to be a little less now, but they're still going through and dropping, you know, either wipers because of geopolitics at the moment, or, you know, they're just getting in and stealing data and then saying, hey, we're ransoming your data at this point. So I think that was still top of mind for most of my execs. But I think even above that, though, are the nation state actors and, you know, the pre-positioning that we've seen happen with Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon as far as the espionage goes. So I think that there's a lot of concern about, hey, how do we either keep them out, which, you know, they've got a lot more resources than I do, or how do we bounce back from it? So how do we increase our resilience to be able to bounce back from an attack? You know, how do you take a punch and just stay, you know, keep standing up and keep going?
Right. And that makes a lot of sense. And that kind of has been the at least fallback posture for ransomware is let's be able to reconstitute systems quickly. But, you know, of course, you're having a lot of traffic and a lot of people, you know, while that's happening. So you'd certainly like to prevent as much as possible. How do you judge the effectiveness of security measures? You know, there's this thing in security that, well, something hasn't happened yet, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're successful or on the road to success.
Exactly.
So how do you look at that?
Yeah, we use, so we have our own set of metrics that we use. It's the same as probably a lot of other people use, you know, MTTR, what is it? Mean time to detect, mean time to respond, mean time to recover. And then we also look at evictions and things like that if we have any incidents like that. But I really like, the outcome-driven metrics. And I don't know if you've seen those, but they're almost like SMART goals. So it's, a metric, most of these metrics are just numbers. And I say, hey, we've had 140,000 high vulnerabilities that we've remediated this month. Is that good? Is that bad? What's an average? It's just a number. So we're trying to figure out, well, we've remediated all of the high vulnerabilities on critical systems, that we've seen so far. Okay, within our SLA or something to that effect. So that means a little bit more to the board and to, all of these senior executives. Once we're able to start making more of those, I think it'll have a more meaningful impact for us.
Okay, well, that makes sense. And that allows you to then present to the board, here's the stasis point, and we're either, achieving and getting better, or we're falling behind. And that might be where you then can have a conversation about, well, what technologies do we need to bring in, or what staffing do we need to bring in if you're facing more of a threat? So just from our perspective as a vendor, we are involved in providing tools to organizations to do more continuous security assessments and to do continuous and automated penetration testing. So we're trying to lower that mean time to detection. There's been a kind of a traditional way of doing those types of tests, and it's understood that it has to happen for compliance purposes, maybe by hiring third parties. But as we talk to organizations, they're looking at, well, I can't wait until that next test to decide what's going on or to know what's going on. In addition, what we want to do is we want to find what's actually exploitable in this particular environment. So you mentioned, high severity. We kind of take it to the level of, we found something that is actually exploitable today in this environment, as it exists. So I think you're kind of agreeing at least a little bit with what, with what our vision is.
Yeah.
So kind of shifting to today's landscape and the things that are new, curious about your thoughts on internal use of AI. A lot of organizations are struggling with this, that the organizations themselves want to use this, want to take advantage of the technology, but it poses a new security risk. At the same time, we have AI being used by outside actors, and that's really increasing the kind of cycle and pace of threats and the cycle and pace of attacks. So maybe you can just comment on what you see or what other CISOs that you speak with see about those two sides of AI in the security landscape.
Yeah, sure. So internally, probably like everybody else, we got off to a rough start with it. People wanted to bring stuff in, and then we kind of had to start backing out of things. Okay, what are the official stance on which interactive LLM do you want to work with? Which chat GPT do you want to work with? We allow them to use Copilot because we were able to license that. It finally got to GovCloud with Microsoft. Everything's slower with GovCloud. But we told everybody, if you have proprietary or confidential information, you can use it there. If it's above that restricted CJI, criminal justice information, things like that, don't use any of them. But if you need to have a discussion with it about files or DFW specific items, Copilot's the one. We're not going to prevent you from using the others. Just don't put any of our stuff in there. You can ask it generic questions. And I use it all the time. I started off slow when I was using it, but I've gotten to the point, especially with Copilot now, that it can see my files, my emails, all of these types of things, that I can ask it a question. It'll look across all of my sources and be able to provide some really good threat intelligence, which is awesome to me. I can say, I get all of these threat intelligence emails, I get all these documents, DHS, TSA, all of those folks send me information. FIFA at this point is sending me a lot of information. So I'll dump all of it in and say, give me the threat brief for this week from the past 7 days. And it'll look at every resource and pull that in for me. So that's really handy. And then being able to get that to my team and say, are we thinking about these threat vectors or these items? And then the rest of the business is starting to look at how can we gain improvements or efficiencies. And I think that is exactly where we should be looking. We've had 2 large projects that we've created using artificial intelligence, not necessarily chatbots, but AI and MLs, so that we can look at traffic management, and then also how can we go through and do better routing and predictive analysis on failures within the buildings. So an HVAC is going down, great. What else should we be replacing at the same time so that we're not sending technicians out 3 days in a row? Those types of things. So the adversarial side of it, I'm not sure if we've seen it or not. It's really hard to determine. Now, are phishing emails getting a lot better? Absolutely. We're seeing that a lot. We do fortunately have our own countermeasure AIs for that with our email security platform, which is great. It's able to still discern which ones are, threats and which ones are not. Does it 100%? Nothing's 100%. That's why we have to fall back on that resiliency. If somebody does click on something, do we have something else that says, hey, maybe that shouldn't have gone, you shouldn't have done this. Yep. And we're looking at some other training technologies to integrate with those also to give that immediate feedback on, hey, maybe you don't want to send out that email, or maybe you shouldn't have clicked on this. Yeah.
So it's interesting. And you're talking about a lot of things that are human-based, which is important because at the end of the day, there's always a human being enabled by these systems. And so you've thought about AI use internally with what purposes and what data can it be used for, what are the models, and then, the governance of the individuals. Yep. And then in this terms of external threats, hey, you can have security controls, but you also need your people to be aware of phishing emails and that sort of thing. In the penetration testing realm, whether it's done by automated tools like ours or by third parties, often the practice is that that's the beginning of the chain. There might be a phishing email that seeks to get credentials from someone. Then it is attempted to be used to gain access to systems and see how far they can get. And that's kind of where the automation and the more traditional thinking, away from the human factors, comes in, because that intrusion or that, finding of information can now leverage other attacks and other attacks and other attacks, within the org. So what we have thought about and what we try to talk to customers about is the need for continuous security and continuous assessment. Now, that's sometimes a heavy lift because security organizations are often not as large as we'd like them to be. And surprisingly, we've had a lot of organizations tell us, hey, this is great, but you're actually adding to my workload. And what we try to say is, no, we're prioritizing your workload to, what the threat is that's most imminent right now. But just in general, what are your attitudes on continuous security and a move to that, either yourself or in the CISO community that you speak with?
Yeah, I think that, we have a pretty robust CISO community in DFW area. And I'm seeing a lot of the chatter around, the various technologies for that continuous threat monitoring or continuous pen testing. And I think that, that it does have a great place. It's the same thing that the adversaries are doing. Once they do get that foothold in, they're using either AI or automation, at least, in order to do that initial scanning, try to get the data collection back, and then see where they actually want to go. At least that's the intel I'm hearing. So, inside we should be doing either the same thing or at least similar. And the prioritization is huge because, we get bombarded with, hey, there's a breach, there's a breach, there's a breach. There's all these patches coming out for different stuff, especially with Mrvos. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? Is the internet going to burn down, or is it just going to pop? We don't know. It's probably in the middle. Right. But once we start seeing all these, what do we end up doing with it? How do I prioritize the vulnerabilities, the patch management, and then, be able to make sure that everything's secure? So if I know that it's inside and it's buried or it's air gapped, then, I probably don't have to worry about it as much. Do we wait a month to patch it? Maybe. If it's sitting in a DMZ, that's absolutely going to be different. Or do I have controls? So right. If you can take all of those into account, I think that that's the best way to help prioritize. And automation seems like the great way to do that.
Right. Well, that makes sense. And it's kind of what you talked about up front. When you look at risk, do I have it contained, or is it something that, is something that can happen tomorrow? And so you're looking at, well, what controls are around this? So there's information, but then there's your risk assessment, that you put on top of it. So the other interesting thing is that you mentioned standards. So I'm always interested in, how do organizations evaluate new technologies and new initiatives? What do you look to Is it standard compliance? Is it industry analysts? And I'm thinking that you have a really unique situation because of all of the interplay with government agencies, not just being a government agency, but you have TSA and you have Homeland Security and all sorts of things that are working in cooperation with your systems, or they're at least very adjacent to your systems. So is there a heavy lift on standards? If you're going forward with a security initiative, does the FAA weigh in on that? Or is it a decision that stays within DFW?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So FAA does not, TSA does to a small extent. So TSA's, they have a cybersecurity program where we report in for systems that could affect passengers or aircraft, functioning properly or being able to, take off and land and go in a proper manner. So we have some specificity on those. They don't care how we secure it necessarily. They just want to know that we are. And if we can provide them the plan on this is how we're protecting baggage handling, baggage reconciliation, airfield lighting, those types of things that keep the aircraft flying and to keep the passengers moving, then they're okay with it. Obviously, the interesting thing is I've got the trifecta for TSA. I have not only the airplanes, but I've also got rail and pipeline. So we have, all three of the items that TSA looks at there.
Right.
So there is a lot of compliance that we have to look at, but I will say that our federal partners are very good. They've been very helpful with us, and they're always willing to pitch in and say, hey, how can we help? We had some issues come up, and they actually said, can we help you get the Coast Guard out? Because who knew? They've got a great cyber program apparently, and they're willing to come out to some of the folks that CISA and TSA cover and give us a pen test or show us how they do things, which would be amazing, I think, just to get that second perspective. So there's a lot of that.
So yeah, that's an advantage. So you have the stakeholders that you have to consult and you have to get their approval, but then you have the ability to use them as technology partners and too as well. So that's great. Well, kind of an outro question here, and in your experience and in the years you've spent in this, what do you think are unattended threats? Something that's looming that hasn't happened yet. And is there any technology or any direction that you would like to see happen in cybersecurity that you feel is not keeping up with the pace of what you need to do in your job?
Let me take the second one first, because I think that's the easier version. I think that maybe it's the same answer for both now that I'm thinking about it, but vulnerability management is hard. If it was easy, we wouldn't have a lot of the problems that we do today. So, I hate to say that the emerging problem is the same problem that we've had for 40 years, but it is. We're not good at patching. We're not good at rebooting servers after they've been patched. We're not good at keeping the endpoints or third-party tools. Are there tools we could use to do that? Absolutely. But, does everybody have those deployed and are they using them effectively? Not so much. I mean, we see it every day. It's not even necessarily, though, that it's a vulnerability, it's social engineering. Right. And hardening that human, I think that that's key. Making sure that security awareness training is available to those. But I think that, honestly, I just think it's vulnerability management, which is, boring, but hey, it's there.
It's boring, but it's necessary. And in some ways, the problem's the same, except it's faster and more frequent and higher volume. And so it makes it a different problem, in that way.
Yeah.
So the first part of it was, do you see any unattended threats or areas where you say, people really should be looking at this because it's coming down the roadway at us, and we have to think about it?
Well, I still think that AI is a big play in this. So while we are paying more attention to it, I don't know that we're looking in the right areas. Are we doing red teaming against the LLMs when we do have a chatbot sitting out? I saw a funny one the other day. It was a food company that had a chatbot and said, would you like to buy a bowl? And he says, yeah, I'll get a bowl here in a minute, but help me with this Python script. Sure, let me help you with that. And at the end of it, would you like to buy that bowl now? Sure. So, it was interesting. And just doing that red teaming stuff is hugely important against the AIs. Autonomous vehicles, we have a lot of that coming out too, that people are just saying, oh, don't worry about it. It just attaches to the network for some telemetry stuff. yeah, but what can I do if I can get back into that autonomous
Yes.
vehicle? And what havoc can I wreak? Even if it's just disabling the vehicle, that's still a big deal, because then you have to go tow it, right? So I think those are a couple of areas. And I hate to harp on AI, but it's there. Agentic is another one.
Yep.
I don't fully understand it myself yet. I understand some of the capabilities, but it's at some point we're going to have to come to the realization that we have to embrace it and let the business do what the business is going to do in a secure manner. Just put some guardrails in there for them.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think somebody said it the best, is that when the programming language is simply English, people can take that and take it anywhere. And, that expands your threat. But very interesting. And, what you started out with, you've kind of concluded with, is to expand our thinking beyond what people normally think about. I mean, I wasn't thinking about autonomous vehicles, but that's an operational technology itself. And, anything that connects to the network can be an intrusion point. So very interesting. Well, great discussion. I appreciate your sitting down with us today, and I learned a lot.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really do appreciate it. It was a good conversation.
All right. Thanks very much, Eric.